Okay, so you wanted a deep dive into the history of personal identity. Buckle up. We've got ancient myths, revolutions, philosophical debates, and even a little bit of social media. It's going to be a wild ride through time.
It really is fascinating how this idea of self has changed so much.
Right, and get this, it still shapes your life today. We're looking at this academic article that traces how people have understood who they are across different societies and eras.
It's amazing.
So let's start way back with early humans, like hunter-gatherer groups, where survival depended on a strong collective identity.
It's incredible to think about a world where your identity wasn't so much about you, but more about us. It was essential for survival, really.
Like united we stand, divided we fall kind of thing. Everyone working together, sharing, making decisions as a group.
Exactly. And we can still see glimpses of this way of life in some cultures today. The San people of Southern Africa, for example. They still emphasize unity and shared resources in their way of life.
Wow, that's really interesting. Makes you wonder if we've lost something in our modern, individualistic society.
It makes you think, right? And this connection wasn't just practical. It was also woven into their spiritual beliefs. Many early societies had myths and stories that reinforced this collective identity.
Like the Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories.
Exactly. Those stories explain how ancestral spirits created the world and everything in it, emphasizing how everything is connected.
And the Lakota Sioux have Mitakui Oriasan, which translates to, we are all related.
Right. A powerful reminder of our connection to each other, to nature, to the spiritual realm. But as we move through history, things start to shift. Around 10,000 BCE, something big happens. The agricultural revolution.
So farming, how did that change things?
Well, humans start putting down roots. Literally. Permanent settlements lead to surplus food, which means not everyone needs to farm. And that's when we see social hierarchies emerging.
So farming gave us civilization and also inequality.
Huh. Well, in a way, yes. With these new hierarchies, we see new ways of understanding identity. Your place in society, your occupation, your social class all become more important in defining who you are.
It makes you think how that still plays out today.
Absolutely. Ancient Mesopotamia gives us a clear example of this. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest known sets of laws, outlines a society where your identity is tied to your social class, gender, and occupation.
Yeah, it's crazy how much your life could be determined by your place in society back then.
It was a different world. And gender roles also became more defined during this period. With the division of labor in farming societies, men and women started to have more distinct roles.
So even though women were essential to early agriculture, as societies became more structured, they were pushed into more domestic roles.
Yes, unfortunately.
Kind of a step back in some ways.
Yes, and this shift had a long-lasting impact on gender identity. But it's interesting to see how early civilizations grappled with these ideas, even in their myths.
Ooh, tell me more. I love a good myth.
Well, consider Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war. She was powerful and independent, but her stories also reflect the challenges women faced in a society that increasingly defined them by their gender.
It gives us a glimpse into the complex realities of women's lives back then.
Exactly. And as we move on, we meet the ancient Greeks. They took this whole who am I question to a whole new level.
Ah, the Greek philosophers, they really were the original depth thinkers, weren't they?
They were, and their ideas still influence us today. Socrates with his know thyself philosophy.
Right, urging people to examine their own beliefs and motivations.
Exactly. Then you have Plato with his theory of the immortal soul.
Oh, yeah, that blew my mind in college. The idea that our true selves exist beyond our physical bodies.
And then there's Aristotle, who believed true happiness comes from living a virtuous life,
Yeah.
striving to be your best self.
It's amazing how those ideas from thousands of years ago are still relevant.
They are. And while the Greeks focused on individual virtue, the Romans added another layer with their concept of citizenship.
Oh, yes, the Romans. All about empires and order. How did their idea of citizenship affect people's sense of self?
Well, being a Roman citizen came with certain rights and responsibilities. It created a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger.
But wasn't Roman citizenship pretty limited?
Unfortunately, yes. Slaves, women, foreigners were mostly excluded.
So even as societies developed more complex ideas about identity, equality was still a long way off.
A very important point. And that leads us to the Middle Ages, when faith became central to shaping personal identity. As the Roman Empire faded and the Middle Ages began, we see a big shift in how people understood their place in the world.
It's almost like the whole idea of self gets redefined. We go from citizenship and civic duty to something way more focused on faith.
Yeah, exactly. With the rise of Christianity in Europe, your relationship with God became the most important thing.
So it wasn't about your tribe or social standing, it was about your connection to something much bigger.
Right. And this is reflected in so many ways. Think about the pilgrimages people undertook, often facing hardship, to visit holy sites. It was a powerful expression of their religious identity.
Yeah, like a physical manifestation of their faith, a way to connect with a larger community of believers.
Exactly. And then you have monasticism, where people renounced everything to dedicate their lives to prayer and contemplation.
It's such a radical choice.
It was a profound commitment, embracing a collective religious identity. But this emphasis on faith also brought a new kind of introspection. People began to grapple with questions of free will versus divine grace.
So this internal struggle emerges, this questioning of who am I? Am I in control, or is there a higher power guiding me?
Absolutely. It's a tension that runs through a lot of religious thought. And one figure who really embodies this is St. Augustine.
Oh yeah, St. Augustine, his book Confessions.
Confessions is a deep exploration of faith, sin, and redemption.
I've heard of it but haven't read it. What kind of questions was he struggling with?
Well, he was trying to understand the nature of good and evil, the role of divine grace, and how much control we actually have over our actions.
Stuff that's still relevant today. How much of who we are is predetermined? How much control do we have over our choices?
Exactly. Augustine's writings give us a glimpse into how people wrestled with these big questions about identity and the human condition.
Wow. It's amazing how these questions have been around for centuries. But while Europe was all about Christianity, what was happening elsewhere in the world?
Great question. Across the Mediterranean, the Islamic world was having its own golden age.
So while faith was also central to identity there, it wasn't just about doctrine.
Right. Islamic scholarship at this time had a strong emphasis on knowledge, reason, and critical thinking. Thinkers like Avicenna and Al-Ghazali made huge contributions to philosophy, medicine, and theology, trying to connect faith and reason.
Sounds like they were really pushing boundaries, exploring with curiosity.
Absolutely. And their work had a big impact, not just on the Islamic world, but also on the West, as their ideas were translated and studied. It was a time of exchange and intellectual growth, showing that the search for knowledge crossed geographic and religious borders.
It's amazing how different cultures, even with different beliefs, were both grappling with these fundamental questions about the human experience.
It shows how universal those questions are, right? This human desire to understand ourselves and find meaning.
Absolutely. And as we come out of the Middle Ages, we enter a period that feels a bit more familiar in terms of how we think about ourselves.
You're talking about the Renaissance.
Yes, a time of rebirth, rediscovery after the darkness of the Middle Ages.
A turning point.
Yep.
We see a resurgence of interest in classical learning. Humanism becomes central, and there's a new focus on human potential.
Like a shift from God-centered to human-centered.
Yeah.
And this marks a change in how we see ourselves as individuals, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Thinkers like Petrarch and Erasmus champion the idea that we shape our own destinies.
Not just passive recipients of divine will, but active agents in our own lives.
You got it. And this new emphasis on the individual is everywhere.
Yeah.
In art, literature, science, exploration.
And Renaissance artists moved away from stylized religious imagery.
Embracing realism, celebrating the human form.
Like rediscovering the human body, the human spirit. You can't talk about the Renaissance without mentioning Michelangelo's David.
Ah, David. The embodiment of the Renaissance ideal. Human perfection, strength, potential.
And then you have Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, that mysterious smile capturing something deep in the human psyche.
Like she's inviting us to look deeper, contemplate the complexities of the soul. And Leonardo da Vinci himself, a true Renaissance man, artist, scientist, inventor, engineer, he embodied the potential of the human mind.
Talk about a multi-hyphenate. And Da Vinci's notebooks, they show his curiosity, his constant questioning, desire to understand.
Yes, and it's this spirit that lays the groundwork for the next big shift, the Enlightenment.
Oh, the Enlightenment? This is where those ideas about individual rights take root and spark revolutions.
It's a pivotal moment. Get ready to explore how the Enlightenment changed everything. Not just societies, but how we understand who we are as individuals.
The Renaissance set the stage, and then bam, the Enlightenment hits. With all these radical ideas.
It was a wild time. Thinkers, challenging authority, questioning everything.
Like, wake up. You have the power to think for yourself, to demand your rights.
Exactly. And that changed how we see identity, individual autonomy, self-determination, those became central.
So it wasn't about your social class or religion anymore.
Not as much. It was about recognizing everyone's rights and freedoms.
So who are the big names in this identity revolution?
Well, you can't talk about the Enlightenment without John Locke. His idea of tabula rasa, the blank slate.
We're born blank, and our experiences shape who we become.
Exactly. He believed education and environment were key.
But wasn't that a little simplistic? Don't our genes matter too?
It's a debate that's still going on.
Nature versus nurture, right.
Right. But Locke's ideas were revolutionary for their time. They shifted the focus to the individual's potential to grow and change.
Makes sense. And then there's Rousseau, right? With his social contract.
Well, oh yeah, Rousseau. He believed we give up some freedom for the benefits of living in a society.
Like a trade-off. Security for freedom.
Exactly. And he thought government should be based on the consent of the people.
Pretty radical for that time.
It was. And these ideas, they sparked revolutions like in America and France.
People throwing off tyranny, demanding liberty and equality.
The power of ideas in action.
But even with these revolutions, equality wasn't for everyone.
Sadly, no. Women, people of color, many were left out.
So the Enlightenment didn't erase all inequality.
True. But it planted the seeds for change. The fight for equality continues.
Progress isn't always a straight line.
Right. And in the 19th century, another big force appears. Yeah. The Industrial Revolution.
Factories, steam engines, all that. How did that affect identity?
Well, it created new urban identities. People moving to cities for factory jobs, forming new communities based on shared experiences.
So your job became a bigger part of who you were.
Exactly. And it led to class consciousness, workers recognizing their shared interests.
Like the labor movements fighting for better conditions.
Exactly. Their identity as workers fueled their fight for justice.
It's amazing how identity can drive social change.
It can. Our sense of self is shaped by the world around us.
But the Industrial Revolution wasn't just factories, right? There was also romanticism.
Ah, yes. Romanticism, a pushback against the harshness of industrial life.
So all about emotion, nature, individual expression.
Exactly. Think Wordsworth, Shelley. They explored identity, human connection.
In a world that was changing so fast.
Yes. It shows the complexity of being human, right?
We want progress, but also connection, meaning...
And these desires shape how we see ourselves.
And that takes us into the 20th century, with even more shifts in how we understand identity.
Civil rights movements, feminism, LGBTQ plus activism, post-colonial struggles.
All challenging norms, broadening our understanding of who we are.
Exactly. We start to see identity as this complex mix of factors.
Race, gender, sexuality, class, religion, nationality.
It becomes more fluid, multifaceted.
Not about fitting into boxes anymore.
Right. It's about understanding how all those pieces come together.
Like Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality.
Such an important concept.
It shows how someone's experience of discrimination isn't just about one thing. It's about how all those aspects of their identity come together.
Exactly. It's about the intersection.
It helps us understand social inequality better and highlights the need for inclusivity and understanding.
And for listening to people's lived experiences.
For sure. And speaking of experiences, we can't forget about the digital age and how it affects our identity.
The internet, social media, they've created a whole new way to express ourselves.
We curate our online selves, connect with people globally, but it raises some big questions too, right?
Definitely. Like, is your online self your true self?
And there's that pressure to present a perfect image.
It's important to remember, social media is just one part of who we are.
It's about finding that balance, being authentic, but not letting it define us.
Exactly. And in the 21st century, identity will keep evolving, shaped by technology, social movements, cultural shifts.
So from ancient tribes to social media, the way we see ourselves has always been changing.
It's fascinating to think about how far we've come.
And to imagine what the future holds for the idea of self.
What new identities will we create? What challenges and opportunities await?
Great questions to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the history of the self.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep diving deep.